My name's Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and I'm very pleased to have Pat LaBarbera with me this afternoon. And we are in two different countries, but we're doing the Zoom thing.
Yeah.
Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Monk. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to tell you that I have been, as a child mostly, through Mount Morris many times.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
We used to travel from Rochester down to the southern tier to visit
Yeah.
relatives. And when I saw that, about where you're from and your brothers, and I wondered if the Mount Morris Shopper, which was the local newspaper,
Yeah.
did they ever do a story on your family band?
Yeah, there was quite a few. Actually, the Mount Morris Enterprise was the paper before that. There was two
I see.
papers. Yeah, the Picket Line Post and the Mount Morris Enterprise had early, really early stuff on us in the 50s. What the Enterprise or the Shopper would do is they put those little photo sequences in, like they put a picture from the past newspapers that were in town, and then a little comment on that. But yes, they did one on all of us and my father.
Yeah.
You know, that paper.
Were your mother and father both on the same page as far as, I don't know if I should can say raising musicians, but I'm guessing this was not a chore for you.
Well, no, I think my mother just went along with the program. She played piano, and she was interested in music. But my mother was a nurse. My father was the one that really got us going with it, and he started us off really young and kind of grooming us as a family band. And then we would go out and play jobs with my father or with kind of a composite of something that he had put together with the three of us. Then my mother got upset because she was left at home. So she started playing bass, learning how to play bass. And then we went out as a family band and worked as a family band.
So you were playing gigs at an early age. Did they pay you?
Yeah. Yeah. We used to get $5 sometimes, which was pretty good in 1954, 55, but
Yeah.
the jobs were like you played 55 minutes on and 5 minutes off, basically, for weddings. So I mean, you were just going all the time. Yeah, I mean, I started working in 54, I think. 54, yeah.
Wow.
I was 8 years old. And my brother Joe was probably working when he was around 6 or 7, maybe 6.
What was the set list like at that time? You probably were playing swing era tunes, but also maybe whatever was being on at the radio.
Swing and pop music of the day, Glenn Miller stocks. A lot of them were stock arrangements. A lot of Italian tunes. If it was Italian weddings, we had to play all of the traditional Italian mazurkas and polkas. And so he had a whole library of that Italian music. And then the pop music of the day, which was in the 50s. A lot of the stuff was kind of some funny stuff, but a lot of it was swing. He had quite a few stocks from the 30s and 40s, basically, because he had his own dance band at one time. So he had ordered all the stock arrangements. So we had In the Mood and String of Pearls and the Casaloma Orchestra stuff, and he had bunches of books of jazz transcriptions, Frankie Trumbauer solo books and Chu Berry solo books and Toots Mondello books, So we had all of these transcribed solos that he would get us to read.
At some point, um, did your father say, especially to you and John on trumpet, that okay, now it's time to play music that's not on the page? And how did he describe that?
I'll tell you my first experience with that because we never did that. What happened was we always read the solos that were written in there. There were only little note solos that were written. And the first time I remember, we were playing a talent contest in Danville, New York, with the family band. I've even got a picture of the night somewhere where somebody took it from the audience. And I had to stand up and read the transcribed solo. And I looked down and I lost my place. So I just started improvising. And after the set, I remember we finished, and I went over in the off stage to my two brothers, and they said, "Man, I just made up my own stuff, and it felt really great. I was really enthused about it, and that was the first time I ever had really improvised on my own." And then from then on, it didn't last that long. The spark. I mean, we kept doing it as kids. So it didn't really hit me until I got into high school. That's the direction I wanted to go into. And it wasn't my father; it was my school music teacher that really instilled the spark about jazz.
I see. Were you and your brothers? Did you have some notoriety in high school, like almost as if you were the quarterback and the wide receiver and the fullback or something on the football
Yeah,
team?
I mean, we had some articles in the paper. We auditioned for the Ted Mack Amateur Hour. We auditioned for the Mickey Mouse Club. I remember that, and they put little articles on us in the paper. But no, it wasn't really something that went anywhere or followed us anywhere. We were just,
Hmm. Well,
everybody knew that we played music, and we were, they knew we were musicians.
where did you go to audition for the Mickey Mouse Club?
It was in Rochester,
Oh yeah,
Sibley's. I think was it Sibley's
right.
a
Okay,
building upstairs on one of the floors. Yeah. Jimmy Dodd came, and he was one of the guys that auditioned us. And Steve Gadd, of course, went. I think Steve won. I think Steve won an audition. Did something. I remember Steve Gadd auditioned for the Mickey Mouse Club too. Yeah.
wow. Was there any rivalry with your brothers regarding music?
Never. We've always gotten along. We never had any kind of arguments that I can see. We kind of always basically I was the first one interested in jazz. I got interested in it. I roped my brother John and Joe into it. I got them into it, and then some local kids that were in school with us. I got one of them to play bass, and a couple that played trumpet, and but we never really fought over anything. We even to this day we're still in kind of an agreement, and it's kind of unusual. There's a lot of I play a club here called the Rex, and I know the club owner Bob is always amazed that the three brothers get along. And so we've always gotten along.
I'm
I guess
happy to hear that.
it was instilled
And
in us. And my father did that to us, and he just made sure that none of us really. I mean, there was always little spats occasionally, but never any grudges.
I see. What were your aspirations? You went to SUNY Potsdam. I had a SUNY experience at Fredonia, and I wonder when you went there, did was your jazz interest met at SUNY Potsdam?
I have to say no, but I auditioned for Fredonia first. That's where I wanted to go because I knew that Don Menza and Sam Noto, or Don Menza had gone there. And there's a bass player named Link Milliman who played bass. Link was from basically 6 miles outside of Mount Morris, is where he grew up. So I used to play with his father, his mother, and his sisters, and with Link. So I knew they went to Fredonia, so I auditioned for Fredonia, but they turned me down because I couldn't sight sing. They made me, like I played and auditioned, and then they put a piece of sight singing up there. I never sang anything, and so they said no. They turned me down, and then I at Potsdam. See, the other thing was that I wasn't a clarinet player. I was a saxophone player and wanted to get into New York State as a saxophone player, but they didn't take saxophone players. But the year that I went in '62. I was the first saxophone player in the state of New York that was allowed to go into the state of New York school system as just primarily a saxophone player. And because you always had to be a clarinet major and then double on saxophone player for what they had at that time called the Wind Ensemble. You probably remember William Musser had the Wind Ensemble.
Hmm.
So when I went to Potsdam, my music, I don't, at the time, he did not want me there. He actually said, "How did you ever get into this school?" He was a clarinet major, and he just did not want me, and it made it difficult for me. And then there was an opening in the wind ensemble, and Joe Roccasano, I don't know if you know Joe, Joe was a great saxophone player. Joe was going to school at the time, and he auditioned me on tenor to go into the wind ensemble, and he said, "Yes, that's good. You'll pass. You go in." And my clarinet teacher blocked it, said, "No, I don't want him in the wind ensemble." So with that animosity, I only lasted one semester, and jazz was not, the school system at that time. The big band had to rehearse off campus. You couldn't use
Yes.
the school facilities and all that. But yet, they had sent a jazz combo from Potsdam to Villanova Festival, and they got all kinds of notification. And a lot of these places got awards. I see, Nick Brignola at Ithaca College with Reese Markowitz. They all got noticed and they won this award, but yet you couldn't practice jazz in no practice rooms at Ithaca College. It was, you know, it's a different era back then.
Yes.
Now Potsdam has a great jazz program. All of the schools do. Eastman does
Yes.
do it. At one time, Eastman, forget it. They
Well,
didn't want to know.
if it make you feel any better regarding Fredonia, Don Menza told me when he was at Fredonia, he said practicing bebop was a felony. Practicing Dixieland was just a misdemeanor.
Yeah, I know Men's told many stories about that. It's
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
it was the turn of a different era of music. And I just happened to be right in the middle of that thing. It was turning around in the 60s. And you're talking 1962. I'm
Okay.
sure by about 10 years later, everything had changed around because every school had to have some kind of a big band or jazz band
Right.
program.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that a bit later. I was reading in the Grove Dictionary of Jazz. There's an entry on you and your brothers,
Oh, yeah.
and I was going to read. It's a challenge. They try to describe musician styles, sometimes in one sentence for space reasons. I was
Mhm.
going to read. I was going to read what they said about you, but I'm thinking, how would you like an opportunity to describe your own playing in about 20 words? Can you do that?
Well, my playing comes from the earliest references that I referenced were basically Jerry Mulligan, Prez, Stan Getz, Sonny Rollins, the Coltrane. I mean, I listened to all those guys. Lester Young was a huge influence on me, and even to this day, as I went through all of the periods of music, listened to everybody, studied with everybody that I could. And playing with Elvin, you had to play a certain way, or I felt that I did. And I'm more modern, but even now today, I go back to Lester Young and the things that I learned about Prez. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just one of those. I'm drawn back to that, but I would say Stan Getz, Richie Camuke was one of them. Lester Young for sure. I mean, Prez. I copied a lot of Prez solos, and Jerry Mulligan was huge influence on me, and all the guys that worked with Jerry Mulligan, because I
I
bought all
see.
the albums. Ben Webster meets Jerry Mulligan, Johnny Hodges. I used to copy Johnny Hodges solos. So all of those guys were big
Nice.
influences.
Well, I'll read what they said. They should have called you. He said, in regards to your style, his style is derived principally from that of John Coltrane, to which he adds his own rhythmic looseness and lyricism.
I mean, you listen to early Train, and it's Prez, and it's Gene Ammons, and it's Dexter. I mean, they're all in there. Everybody's kind of mixed up in there. But yeah, I mean, the time that I was probably being more recognized for my soloing would have been with Elvin Jones. With
Mm-hmm.
Buddy, of course, I was known as a soloist, but with a big band, you're only going to get a small chunk of space to solo, right? Maybe one big feature that you get to Channel One Suite was something that I kind of inherited from Don Menza.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Elvin's band, when they hear me play, and those articles were probably written back then, I was, heavily influenced by Train. It's pretty hard not to go down that road when you're playing with Elvin, and then especially if you're playing with Elvin and McCoy and Reggie Workman, and all of a sudden there's that trio behind you, and I'm going to come out and play like Zoot Sims. It just didn't fit the flow of where I felt that the time was. So, and I wanted to study. I learned that music. I studied. Used to go see Coltrane all the time when I was in Rochester or going to Berkeley. That was one of the things you did when he came to town. You went down to see him.
Can you describe what that was like, leaving the club after seeing Coltrane?
Well, there was a couple of times when I left the club early and had to go outside just to kind of just calm down because it was, frantic sometimes in that period. So we were catching him 64, 65, 66. It was, it was certainly an eye opener. And I learned, the dedication. You used to watch Train come off the bandstand and then go right into either a room where they put the beer cases and all of that, and he'd just keep playing. And then I was lucky enough to, when I was at Berkeley, one of my friends was a waiter at the Jazz Workshop, and he got us to go in, and in the daytime we'd go in and listen to Train practice, because he would come to the Jazz Workshop, go into the dressing room, And then the three guys, we were three of us, we would sit there and order a Coca-Cola at lunch, and there was nobody in the club, and he would be practicing in the background, and we'd be trying to figure out what he's doing. And he was right next to the bathroom, so every once in a while we'd pretend we had to go to the bathroom and look in. And I remember seeing that he had a whole table full of reeds, and we used to just listen to see what he would be practicing.
I'm trying to form a question here about what did you try to copy?
Oh boy, Train. I mean, the sound was one of the things that I've always been drawn to. His use of vibrato in the later period, where he was really almost into a classical vibrato. Well, when I studied at Berkeley with Joe Viola, he stressed classical etudes, but not playing in that style. And so what I was always listening to the way Train would use his vibrato, where he would play usually a jaw vibrato, but sometimes a jaw and a diaphragm combination vibrato. I heard Sonny Rollins doing the same thing, where they combine the flute ha 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 with the ya 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 jaw, so you get two things working at once. You get the depth of the stomach vibrato, so that's going here and there. It's kind of tricky to. I just picked it up, but yeah, I mean, I copied a lot of his solos. I mean, not in total, but more like what was that phrase, and I would listen to what's that idea. I would pick little devices out and to see if there were things that I liked.
Did he ever go out too far, in his last year or so, for you to keep up with?
There were times when, like one of my let's see, Expression, that album, that last, there's one there where I really liked from that period back, and then forward. The other ones like Ohm and some of those other ones, would be Live in Seattle. There's some things that I like, but there was a point where I made it. There was a couple of years there where I decided I'm going to listen to all of that stuff and see what he's trying to get across in there. I always studying it and being an educator also. I mean, I always wanted to kind of understand what's going on with him. Some of it I didn't like all the time, but I certainly I always enjoyed the way he played. Not always the combination of instruments that he had. I could see he was searching for certain things, but didn't always everything didn't appeal to me, but most of it did.
Okay. When you were at Berkeley, were you and your classmates sort of waiting for the phone call?
I wasn't thinking that way when I first went there, because when I came from Potsdam, well, I didn't come right there. I ended up working for a year, and did a lot of day jobs to save money to go to get the tuition, because at the time Berkeley was expensive, $500 a semester, $1,000 a year, 1962. That was unheard of.
It's still unheard of.
My father had to go to some shady characters. I got enough much money as I could, but my father tried to get a loan from the bank and they wouldn't give it to him. So he had to go to some other guys that he knew that were kind of under the radar. But he got the loan, to get me to go to my first semester at Berkeley, and then my other two brothers followed. John went to Potsdam, and then came to Berkeley. Joel went directly to Berkeley afterwards.
They should have given him at least a discount for the,
Right, right. Third one's free.
But I'm sort of wondering. It seemed like Berkeley was a place where band leaders could go and pick up young musicians who were hungry to get out there and play.
Well, I mean, in my first 2 years, I didn't think that way. I was just basically trying to learn everything I possibly could. We had bands, small bands, and Saturday morning, Sunday morning, we'd be rehearsing with our own big bands that we put together. We had access to the practice room, so we could put groups together. And there were a lot of guys that were in school at that time who later became, big names. But we were all just, trying to learn. By my third year, you see, my problem was that I made the mistake of every year going back to Mount Morris, New York, which meant that there were no music jobs or an occasional gig here and there. I had to get a factory job, a truck driving job, a construction job. So I did that every year, except for my last year. when I went my last year, I said, you know what? I'm going to stay in Boston and see what I could pick up. And I stayed in town. And as soon as like a week afterwards, I got a call to do a summer in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, with a quartet. Gene Roma, the drummer, a very fine drummer, was in the band. And I went up there and did that for about 2 months or a month and a half. And then my brother Joe was working with Chuck Israels and Hod O'Brien down in Tanglewood. And he said, you know, there's a jazz club here across the street up on the hill called Avaloch, which they have a jazz club in there. And Randy Weston is leaving, and they're looking for, they put a, you ever seen that movie, The Gig, where they got all these
Yes.
Well, this was the gig, exactly like it. They put all these guys together. Young college guys had gotten this gig, and they needed a saxophone player. So my brother Joe finagled it, and I left the gig in Old Orchard Beach, came down to Tanglewood, and took this gig. When there was all of us living in a house. Now they didn't have a drummer, so they ended up getting the guy who was the bass player, the real jazz guy in the movie. They ended up getting a drummer, actually, who was the real jazz guy. Gene Gamage was a drummer that worked with Oscar Peterson, Chet Baker, Zoot Sims, and Gene was looking for a gig. So he came up. And so here's all of these young college guys and this one guy who'd been on the road with everybody and lived with Scott LaFaro and lived with Joe Romano. And, so Gene came up, and of course and I got to hang out with him, and he became a real close friend all through the years. And then I went back to Berklee, and that was my last year. I started started the semester in September, about 2 weeks in. You want me to keep going with the story because this is where it goes? And
Yeah.
okay, so I went back to Berklee. Jimmy Mosier was the alto player who had just gotten off the summer tour with Buddy Rich. He did the Away We Go Jackie Gleason special, but he came back to Berklee to teach. So they put me in his ensemble, and I was in for about 2 weeks. And on the second week, we all go to a bar afterwards on a Friday night rehearsal. Me, Lynn Bivy. Well, Lynn had left already. And Lynn had gone out on the road, Lynn Viviano, the trumpet player. And he was out with Woody Herman. And so Jimmy Mosier was hanging out in the bar, and he said, you've been in school too long. He said, you should go out on the road. And we're all drinking. And he said, there's a job opening with Buddy Rich. I'm going to make a call and get you the gig. This is we're all drinking Friday. So Monday morning comes around, and I see Jimmy Mosier, and I say, okay, where's that gig with Buddy Rich? He said, quit all your classes and leave for New York. You start Thursday. So I said, oh my God. And I was in the recording band with Herb Pomeroy. I had to go tell Herb Pomeroy I was leaving school. I had to fly home and get a suitcase. And I'd never flown before. I had to go back to Rochester. I had to fly to New York. And Ernie and I were already in an ensemble the year before with Charlie Mariano, but Ernie had taken the gig with Buddy Rich playing lead alto. And Charlie Owens, who was in Berklee, also had taken the second alto gig. So when Jimmy Mosier got me the gig, Ernie knew who I was, and because we had worked together. So I went to New York and I rehearsed for a week with the band without playing. They were working the riverboat, and I went down every night to cop the band so I could see what was going on. Last night, Bobby Keller was the saxophone player. He came up to me and handed me the bag of suits, because the suit and the tuxedo, said, you got it. And I took the suit. Sunday morning, we flew to Minneapolis, St. Paul. First night, Frank Sinatra. The first day, get off the bus. And Jay Corey, who was the tenor player, missed the plane. So I had to play the lead book, which I had never seen. I'd only been rehearsing the fourth book. Now I'm stuck playing West Side Story and then backing Sinatra with a Test of Fire.
You can't make this up.
No, and the thing is, both of my gigs, when I went with Elvin, was the same thing. No preparation, just like bang, just jump in there and had to do it.
Well, that's like graduate school. You can only learn so much in school. What was Buddy like to play right in the beginning for? Was he like?
Yeah, he was. He just said hello to me at the airport, and I could see, excuse me, the show business aspect of it, because he'd always do. He was Buddy, and I just kept my head low and just read the book, did the book. Jay Corey came back after a couple of nights, and I went back to the fourth book, and we were just touring around. We did 1 month tour down into the South. We went back to Los Angeles, played Marty's on the Hill, I believe, and then we left for a tour of the Orient. We went to, Taipei and Hong Kong and Japan, and and then we ended up in Hawaii. So we did a month tour into the whole month of December into January.
Was your mother happy for you?
I think they missed the fact that I wasn't there for Christmas. The first year of '67, I was Christmas in Japan. Um, that was hard for an Italian family, not have everybody together. But and then yeah, they both were. My father was. I mean, the first time he saw me on the Ed Sullivan Show, I said, "Okay, that's everything's fine."
That's great. Well, moving from any big band, as you mentioned, you get a limited amount of time to solo. Sometimes the leader might say, "I'll open up, go around again," but still not too long. So going to Elvin Jones, I'm guessing that was a big change and adjustment for you.
Yeah, we used to have a chart on Buddy's band called Uptight. You remember that? Uptight.
Yeah.
Uptight. Oh, well, we had to just. So Dave Lehman told me when he said, "Man, you went from uptight to up loose," because all of a sudden now I'm coming from you have a solo in a big band and you stand up. You got to go. I mean, it's like machine gun time. Most of the time, unless it's a ballad or a medium thing, but you have to kind of jump in there and you don't leave space and none of that stuff really comes. Now I go with Elvin. The only thing he ever told me, a couple of things, was I played the Vanguard and he said, "Look, you're not playing long enough," because we only played 4 tunes a set, maybe 5, 4 tunes a set. So he said, you got to take your time and develop your solo. And that's something that I had learned earlier on from Lester Young. So it wasn't hard to go back to it. But, don't forget, I'd almost done 7 years with Buddy Rich of doing the other thing. Now I have to go back and learn a whole new way of playing, because I was with Buddy, I'm playing on top of the beat. Now Elvin's time is really, it is a lot of space in the bars that Elvin has, a lot of space. Joe Farrell told me, he said, once you play with Elvin, he said, you'll realize what your time is, and you'll have the best time that you could ever think about, because he's not going to spoon feed you. It's not, it's like a big wash of sound. And you had to kind of learn how to put your lines on top of that, not rush, be relaxed, take your time, leave space to draw the rhythm section into your solo, which again was something I had learned from Lester Young.
Was the difference in bass players make a difference in your playing when you were with Elvin?
Yeah, because the bass player, a lot of times you would rely on the bass player to kind of give you the steady 4, where Elvin would kind of be playing loosey-goosey around it. Strong bass players, Elvin relied on a strong bass player. He didn't like a bass player that played the amp over the sound of the string, the percussiveness of the string. If you had a bass player, if he was putting this much intensity into the ride cymbal and the bass player was just doing this because he's allowing it, there's a mismatch of energy that isn't there, and he would feel it, so he would get really upset at that. He didn't have many of those guys. All the guys that I played with when I first went on were always strong bass players.
I don't know if you can answer this, but if you were playing an extended solo with Elvin Jones Trio, what is going through your head? Are you thinking harmonically, or that's my question?
I know all of the I know all the changes. When I learn a tune, I have to know everything that's going on underneath me. Do I hear it at first? Maybe not. When I first learned how to memorize in blocks, when I was working in the factories, that's how I learned my tunes. I used to work for Mohawk Tires, and I worked for the canning factory in Mount Morris, where I had to load pallets, stack pallets up with boxes 6 feet high, and then ring the buzzer for the forklift, and then I'd stack. So I do this all day long. So I would bring my tune in, and I had a tune on an index card with the changes all written out, and I'd tack it up to the post that was right next to me. And as the boxes came down, I'm going G minor 7, C minor 7, F 7, B flat. And by the time I got home at night, I knew the changes like I learned poetry, because I had a great English teacher who taught me how to memorize poems. And so I learned them, but I didn't hear them. Now I get home, I know all the changes, don't have to look at a book. I know the melody, and now I start looking at the melody and seeing what I memorized, and then started to play up and down what I had memorized to hear it that way. Well, it's kind of a weird way of learning how to play, but that's how I did it. So when I was with Elvin, the changes were not a problem. Then I realized that melody is really your prime source to glean improvisational, ideas from. My biggest thing is you listen to somebody play straight no chaser, okay? You got that melody, all that chromaticism. The minute the head stops, how many people reference the melody? They go right into their stock way of playing on the blues, but yet there's that great, source there of all of that chromatic material. Very few people glean, and that's kind of a good way to practice. Think of that tune and then solo off that tune, and then go back to play a standard and think about what does that melody mean?
Good
I
advice.
mean,
Yeah.
today, I mean, it's a lot of it is technique. There's so much technique involved in playing today. Bobby Shew once told me a great, Bobby Shew, he told me a great little statement that I've always remembered. He said, "Do you play to impress or do you play to inspire?" And so I always think about that when I play. I'm not trying to dazzle you with my technique. I'm trying to like draw you into a theme, a melody, a theme, a set of changes, and a direction that I'm going with my solo. So building the solo is important. You have to depend on who just soloed before you, because you have to take you have to keep that in your mind. If you have somebody playing up hundreds of notes and really busy solo, you can't come in and keep doing that, because it's going to just be just a continuation. And if you want people to listen to you, basically you have to deflect the direction and go a different way to build your solo to grab the listener.
If you're teaching a student um, and they are, let's suppose they're playing on So What,
Mm-hmm.
and they're obviously missing the half step change. Um, my question is about wrong notes.
Yeah.
What term do you use with them? I mean, wrong notes now seems to be a thing like, well, don't call them wrong notes.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you approach them with you're playing wrong notes? It's the
Yeah.
best I can say.
What I do is I actually make students play wrong notes. I'll do a tune like So What, and I'll just say, okay, let's figure out the notes that are going to sound bad on D minor 7. Okay, let's figure the notes are going to be something that, and let's work on hitting that note E flat, right? Okay, an F sharp on the D minor 7 chord. Let's practice hitting those notes first of all to get rid of the fear of hitting a wrong note, because that's one thing that keeps people from going keeps them from searching, is they're always afraid, like, oops, I'm gonna no. I just say, okay, let's play a blues. I play a blues and I say, just play as let's play as much activity that you want that's just chromatic and out, but resolve it toward the end and come back into the chord. So if you've got D minor 7, play 3 bars out of chromatic nonsense, no matter what you hear, but get into the D minor at the back at the end. Now hold some of those notes that you find unpleasant and resolve them, see where they go. So that if you're ever into that spot where but don't be afraid of them, because those sometimes are the strengthening notes that pull you into the chord sound. Upper and lower, I don't want to get too technical, but upper and lower, the appoggiatura, upper and lower chord tones, a half step above, half step below. Pentatonics, I do that all the time with students. If I have them playing on a D minor pentatonic, I'll say, okay, play the pentatonic a flat 6 away and a flat 5, or a sharp 5 and a flat 5 away. So D minor, right? You play B flat minor pentatonic, play a couple of notes of B flat minor, come into D minor. Play more notes of B flat minor, come back in. Do the same thing with it's the root and the fifth, right? Because in harmony, the fifth can always be replaced by another note. The root has to be there, but the fifth is one of the notes that you can kind of get rid of on a chord and still keep the quality, right? So this is a device that Train used. So he would have D minor 7. He would play E flat minor pentatonic, right? Or a C sharp minor into D, right? Or a half step above the fifth, B flat minor, or A flat minor below the fifth. But you just play a few of those notes and then come back in.
Hmm.
And then a few notes out and come back. Just get used to hearing those notes out but feel the resolution. That's a little more advanced than learning how to play one or two wrong notes. But those are devices that train you, because if you hear anybody play, so what? Nobody plays in the mode at all. Maybe Miles's first solo, he stayed pretty strict into the D minor door. But after that, everybody went out, in and out of the chord, upper and lower neighbor tones. There's so many devices. The train would superimpose giant steps changes over it before he would come back into it.
Yeah.
So much theory there. But it all came from the fact that if you want to play the Dorian mode in a church setting, the way, those church modes, fine, you stay in the mode, traditional way of speaking, but nobody ever plays that way when you're playing.
That's very interesting because they make such a big deal out of modes, but I'm not sure that the people that are making a big deal about it are actually players. Sometimes they're critics trying to figure out how to describe.
I mean, what we learn as modes. I mean, everybody's been playing those for centuries, and improvising on them too. I mean, it gets a little bit hairier if you go on to more advanced thinking, like Messiaen. Messiaen, the composer, his modes of limited transposition take you in another direction. They're a whole different way of thinking about music. The altered scales and the diminished scale and all those things, the pentatonic scales and there's Hungarian double harmonics and all of these scales people use them in jazz, but
Well, you went from Woody Herman and Buddy Rich and Elvin Jones. Were there any gigs that you turned down along the way?
Well, I was with Woody Herman only for a short bit. I just went out to help Frank Tiberi, and they just called me out as a sub. I loved it, but I wasn't with him for a long time. Same with the Glenn Miller band. I went out for a bit to help somebody needed to get off for a week. I turned down Joe Henderson. Believe it or not. I'll tell you why. Because I was studying with Joe Henderson in New York. I was on Buddy Rich's band, and Joe called me one day. I was at the President Hotel in New York, and he called me and he said, he goes, I need somebody to go on to play bass clarinet. He wanted me to play bass clarinet. I said, Joe, I can't play bass clarinet. I think Pete Yellen was doing the gig maybe at the time. I'm not sure if Pete was doing it, but he wanted me to go out and play with a band, and he had this idea of bass clarinet. And I just said, I can't do it. I'm not a bass clarinet player. I mean, I can play, I had to play clarinet with Buddy's band, and I started on that instrument. No way I was going to go out and embarrass myself with Joe Henderson.
Oh, was he had a big band at the time?
I'm not. No, this was a small band. He had like, I think. It was either Julian Priester. I think he had three horns in front. I know at one point he had alto trombone and himself on tenor. I had seen that band at the Vanguard. I don't know what he was thinking at the time, but he was always composing. When I was with him, he was writing for Blood, Sweat and Tears. When I was studying with him, he was kind of doing that Blood, Sweat and Tears band that never took off. They were just rehearsing all the time.
Yeah. I remember seeing that, like Joe Henderson is with Blood, Sweat and Tears, because I love Blood, Sweat and Tears.
I went to take a lesson one time, and Joe said, look at this. He said, I got a complete brand new Magnavox sound system. He goes, I've got it over here. They gave me a tenor, a Barry, an alto, a soprano, because Magnavox owned Selmer at the time. He said, I got all of this stuff they gave me. I joined a rock band. I played jazz all my life. Nobody ever gave me anything. He said, I go with one rock band and look at all the stuff they give me.
Going back to Buddy for a minute, of course, it was mostly young guys, but there were some older veterans in that band, like Al Porcino.
Yeah, well, Al came on just after I joined. He came on in January of '68.
Yeah. Were those guys, did they teach you anything?
No, I mean, Al Porcino and Art Pepper came on right at the same time, right? So I sat next to Art Pepper for almost a year, the Buddy's band, because Menza came on around the same time too. So yeah, when Jake Corey left in Vegas in '68, I took the tenor chair for about a month, and then Don Menza came on with the lead chair, and I went back to the fourth chair, which was good for me because I got a chance to kind of hang out with Art Pepper and hang out with Don, who taught me a lot. Menza taught me a lot. I mean, he was just like a father to me. He taught me all kinds of, still to this day, we talk almost every week. And Yeah, hanging out with those guys. Art Pepper was great. Al was really interesting, and he had given me a whole bunch of Charlie Parker teas. I used to drive him around. I had a Volkswagen that I rented, and I would take him to places that he had to go. And he gave me a bunch of Charlie Parker reel-to-reel tapes that he had done when he was on Woody's band, and he played the Apollo Theater. And he took his reel-to-reel tape recorder and held it up backstage next to the speaker back there, and he taped all of these bird shows, and then he gave them to me, and I put them on cassette. I still have them downstairs. They're all out on CD now, but yeah, Al would give me stuff. And he, of course, a lot of stories about all the older guys.
Yeah. I heard a story about something about the Playboy Club with Buddy Rich and Al.
Yeah, yeah, downstairs in Hugh Hefner's, he had a game room downstairs in the bar with a
Uh-huh.
with a big glass window that went into the swimming pool, and Al Porcino swam by with nothing on in the nude, swam by the window of the pool. Yeah,
Did
yeah.
did you your your entrance into jazz education and academia, was that partly to change a lifestyle of being on the road?
Never thought I'd be my father was a music teacher. I helped my music teacher in school teach younger kids clarinet. Never thought about teaching. Went to Potsdam State Teachers College and never thought about teaching. Went to Berkeley, never crossed my mind. I moved to Canada in '74, and I was with Yamaha at the time. I had signed with Yamaha in the States the last couple of months with Buddy Rich. And so when I came to Canada, I was with Yamaha. They called me, they said, we've got this young student they call him the Rising Star, Yamaha Rising Star Award. We wonder if you give him a couple of lessons. I said, yeah, I never taught anybody. I don't know about teaching. He said, well, give him a try. So I had him come by my house on Saturday mornings, and we'd go there for 4 hours. And I basically just retraced my steps of how I learned what I did, because I had lots of notes. I mean, I had been, since being in Berkeley, I had all kinds of notes. I learned how to take notes. I learned how to write all my practice routines down. So I just kind of I listened to him play, and I could see what he needed just by, if it's, musculature or embouchure or whatever, I could see that. And then the theory about improvisation was something I had just picked up on my own through Berkeley correspondence course. When I was in Potsdam, I was still studying the Berkeley correspondence course. And all the stuff I learned in Berkeley and then with Herb Pomeroy and Ray Santisi and Charlie Mariano, I just basically retraced my steps and showed him what to do. And then there's a college here in Toronto called Humber. Humber College is the Berkeley of Canada. They had the first program. Matter of fact, some of the guys from Berkeley came up to help them establish this school. And there's a arranger named Ron Collier, one of Canada's most famous arrangers, one of the only guys to ever arrange for Duke Ellington and write for Duke Ellington, Canada. He started this program at Humber, and they have been running about 3 or 4 years. And they heard that, and I had taught this kid who went eventually to the school, and they called me and asked me, they said, would you like to teach 3 more students? I said, oh, okay, private lessons. And so, and I wasn't getting a lot of work. See, when I first moved to Canada, I couldn't work for 6 months because of the union rules. They had a rule you couldn't work a steady job. I was sneaking across the border before computers and they could check up on you. I would go back to Rochester to work Italian weddings. I'd work up north so they couldn't trace me. You had to kind of do everything under the table because you weren't allowed to work a steady gig. I had a baby on the way, and so I couldn't do that. So I took this job, and then Elvin called me in '75, like a year later, and I got the call. And he had been trying to get me because he basically wanted me to join when he sat in Buddy's band in Ronnie Scott's. A year before, he came in and sat in and took my number and was, if I was interested. But then I moved to Canada and he lost all my contact information. So he called me, and then that was around 1975. So I had taken this part-time job teaching, and then Elvin called me. So I took the job with Jones, and I did the part-time lessons as I could, throughout the semester, which was something they allowed me to do. I said, I've got to travel to make a living here because I'm not doing anything in town. And so that's what happened. I got the job with Elvin, and then I started to get more and more students each year, but it was always part-time until the '80s when they offered me '87, they offered me a full-time position. So I was off and on with Elvin for almost 20, 20 years plus. I would go out with him, for 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79. I was with him pretty much. Then I left for a bit, came back, left, came back, helped him out. And then his last 2 years, I went back for his 75th birthday tour and did 2 years on a sabbatical that I had taken from school. And then he passed away in the following year.
Am I correct that you worked with him more in Europe than you did in the States?
Yeah, we had a few. Yeah, we did mostly Europe. We did a lot of European festivals. Uh, Italy, the first tour I did was Sweden and Italy. We played Ronnie Scott's every year. Um, Same as Buddy's band. Buddy would play Ronnie Scott's. Elvin would play Ronnie Scott's. We worked all through Europe. We did South America. We did a tour down there in 1970. I can't remember, in the 70s. This was whenever, and see, this we went down for the CIA. It was like a branch of the CIA called the U.S. Information Service. They sent us to every trouble spot in South America, right? So we went to Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Medellin, Bogota, Cuenca, Guayaquil, Santiago. Every place where there was some. They sent us down as a kind of a peace thing. So we went there with that, and we went to Japan with Elvin. In the States, we always had a circuit. We would work Vanguard 2 or 3 times a year. We'd work the Jazz Showcase in Chicago. I don't remember. We'd work a couple of other places in Detroit, Baker's Keyboard Lounge. There were some other, spotty places that we would work. But that's about it. There were only a few, places. I don't remember. In California, we'd work the Jazz Bakery. But there wasn't a lot of activity going on at that time.
Through your career, have there been times where there was any racial subject coming into play, black and white musicians, etc.?
Well, yeah, that's just understandable. That goes on.
Yeah.
At that time, when that used to go on Buddy's band, not so much the members of the band, but we would play Florida, and Ernie Watts and Charlie Owens could not swim in the swimming pool. This was in we're talking about the 69, 70, 70, Elvis band was not so much amongst the band members. It was more or less sometimes people who assumed certain things in Europe that the band was all black, and then I show up as a different, because I was at certain times I was the only white guy on the band, but not so, and never amongst the players. And occasionally there was a few guys that came out with some attitudes. Listen, what are you going to do? I mean, I grew up in a town that had that when I was a kid. The Sicilians were looked at as the lowest, ebb at one point in the town that I grew up in. So it was a whole different thing. I mean, I never felt it, but
Yeah.
it's just that was going on. It's just, it never bothered me, and it never bothered Elvin. Elvin didn't see color. He was not that. Oh, he didn't. No, never. We got off a train one time in Germany, and the guy that booked us was this old German Luftwaffe pilot who basically met us at the train. It was me, David Williams, who was from Trinidad, Elvin, and Ryo Kawasaki, who was from Japan. All right, and he comes up with a German accent and he says, "But I thought you was an all-colored band." He tells Elvin, and Elvin goes, "We are." He goes, "We're all colors." He said,
That's a good one.
"Yeah, I mean that's."
Well, music is just like every other part of society, it's everywhere. So
It's stupid.
yeah. So you did some work with the Jamie Aebersold camps. So I want to know, like Jamie says, can anyone improvise?
Well, I think they can. I was talking about that. I watched a beautiful documentary this morning called Moonlight Sonata, and it was all about a deaf child who got cochlear implants when he was young, and they taught him how, and he got to hear, and he ended up performing. It's a beautiful document. I was telling my wife, I said, I used to do that with my classical players, and I said, Jamie used to do that too. You'd get some, even though you're working on a certain performance piece in a lesson, you should always let the student at some point in the lesson make up something of their own so they get the feeling of creating something, even if it sounds horrible. Let them, and that's why Jamie puts on those one chord Dorian Vamps and just said, play something, just play a couple of notes. What do you hear? And just tries to get them to kind of come out of that just reading situation. I taught for Jamie. I taught for Jamie for many years, and then I moved on to the Skidmore Institute, up in Albany, New York, in Saratoga. At Skidmore College, they have a summer institute there. I worked there with Bill Hinton and Eddie Shaughnessy and so many guys. But I just ended up being a teacher, which is something I never thought I'd go into.
Nice. Do your brothers? Do you get on the phone with your brothers and trade band stories, or when the rare moments you all together?
We're all together usually every Sunday around 1:30, and we talk on Zoom, and then we'll pass on stuff, or I'll try to remember. I said, "Do you remember this? Or do you remember this happening? That happened?" And we'll pass on some information. We're always talking, texting.
That's great.
We're constantly in touch with each other. And Joel is not retired yet. John and I are both retired. Joel will be retiring this year. So, I retired not last year, but the year before last, right? 2019, right? And then I kind of remember now. Yeah. And I had I had the whole year blocked off. I was toured Japan, a couple of recordings, and I was going to do a couple of weeks teaching here, some summer jazz clinics. I had concerts booked and all kinds of, and of course, so now I'm practicing every day.
I see.
With the hopes that it's still going to happen. I think I've got a few more years left to help out some notes.
Well, I have an inside source who, I don't know if you want to pursue this story or not, but something that happened with Tony Bennett and Al Hibbler and your brother.
I know the story, but I'm not going to. I wasn't there, and I only heard it third or fourth hand, so I don't want to I don't want to repeat that. Would you mind if we didn't do that?
I do not mind.
I think you should talk to who was on that gig. It would be Paul Langosh, I think. If you know Paul Langosh, I would contact him. I think it was Paul.
Okay.
I don't want to go there, especially in today's.
Jazz myths get spread around too much, so.
Yeah, no, I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that story. Yeah. Sorry, audience.
It's okay.
Yeah.
But along those lines, I'll try a question that hardly ever works also. And that is, do you recall like just a terrible gig or series of gigs that you just couldn't believe you were involved in?
Well, there's, sure. I remember one night I had booked a gig with a group in town here, a guy in town here who I'd worked for doing a lot of trade shows. And he said, you have to go get fitted for a costume. So I went down to this place where they have theatrical costumes, and I went and got fitted for the costume. And he said, we're doing this dentist convention, and the theme is the movie Tom Jones. So you have to get fitted for the satin pantaloons, the button thing, the George Washington wig. And you said, I'll be playing harpsichord, and we'll be playing, tunes like In a 20th Century Drawing Room. And I was taking anything at that time. This was in the early 70s. No, I had a week at the Village Vanguard. We finished on a Sunday night. The gig was on a Monday. So I finished Jones on a Sunday night, and Monday I go down to this gig at one of the hotels here, and I get on stage, and there's the guys with the harpsichords. They're all having the George Washington wigs, and the guys at the harpsichord, there's a bass player and there's a drummer. And we are in straw this thick with goats and chickens and all kinds of livestock on the stage with us. And I was playing flute and saxophone, and we're supposed to be in a barnyard. And I thought to myself, Jones one night and here the next night. Well,
that's real life right there.
But you know what? That working with my father as a kid, learning how to work firemen's picnics and clam bakes and weddings and all of these jobs where you just took them because it was work. I just learned how to tough it out and tough it through. I mean, there were times when I played with Elvin that I hated the gig because of certain things going on. Same thing with Buddy. There were nights when you just didn't do it, but you knew that it was always going to get better. There's always going to be bad nights, and it's just one of those things. And there's always good nights coming down the road at some point, you hope.
Gee, well, that's something that students should know about, although those kinds of gigs are hardly around anymore. I
No,
think it's a shame.
I've been on bands where I didn't like all of the players I was playing with. And there was one
Hmm.
band I was on that I hated everybody in the band except the band boy. I liked the leader, but everybody else I couldn't stand working with. But I did. You had to do it. Once you got on the bandstand, you had to function. If you want to play if you don't want to play the music, you walked out. I've only walked off a couple of gigs, and it's just because the leaders were so obnoxious. I just and after working with Buddy, that's one thing I learned working with Buddy Rich. After you work with Buddy Rich, you never took any crap from anybody because you've seen the original act. I said, I would watch these guys and I'd say, I'm out of here. I don't need this. And I walked off jazz gigs with very famous guys. So I saw the original. I don't need to see a carbon copy. I'm gone. I don't need the money at that point. I did.
I just watched a video with you and Buddy, and the setup was very interesting because he he looked like he would always look to his left when he played for the most part.
Was left. You know why
Yeah,
that was, right?
I do not.
Oh, okay. I asked him one time. I said, because I saw him one night we were playing, and he sat in with Basie's band, and he knew all the charts, Whirly Bird, all of it. He knew everything. And I came out. I said, Buddy, how did you do that without? Because he doesn't read music. He said, well, I know all the charts of every book. He said, Tommy Dorsey, he goes, I have them all in my head. I said, what happens if somebody throws you a chart you don't know? He said, you see why I'm always looking to the left? He goes, I'm watching the lead trumpet player and the lead trombone player breathe. I don't care about the saxophone players, but I'm watching how they breathe. If I know they're going to go, I know there's something coming up, and I can usually psych out the fill. That's what he told me. He said, I learned that from working with Dorsey. He said, I watched them breathe, and I watched the lead guys breathe if there was something I didn't know. But he was
That's
fast. He picked up stuff so fast. He just, I was always amazed how he did it. The Channel One suite, when we did that, we brought it into Las Vegas. We were playing there right after that Japanese tour. And my brother Joe was playing Buddy's drums because he was backing the singer who we were backing, Frankie Randall. So he had Joe come by in the daytime to rehearse Channel One suite. So Joe was the first one to do it. And Channel One suite goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 blah. So it had that kind of that fake for 3 and 5, which is really 8. But that's the way it was broken up. So Joe played it. He listened to it for just a little bit, and he said, "Get off the drums," and he went up and played the part.
Wow. Yeah, we wore out that record with Don's thing
Yeah,
on that.
yeah, men's on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that video, I thought he was staring at you because for some reason you were set up right in his line of sight, and I wondered what that was like because you were soloing.
Well, a lot of times he would rely on me for certain things. If I'm soloing, he could tell when I'm going to finish. He'd also retire. If you look at any time you see, if you could see my wrist, this wrist here, I always had a wristwatch that had the head of the watch turned backwards. So that because Buddy would come off and he would say to me, "How long have we been up here?" And I'd always just look like this because if I look like this, it would look like we were checking the time. So I just looked at my wrist and I could tell him, 40 minutes. He said, "Okay." So he would always ask me that. And then, but he would just he at one point he was relying on me on certain hiring guys, and Rick Stepman was hiring guys at a certain point. Uh, but he was. You never saw him really look over at the rhythm section that much. He was always looking that way and down. I think it was an easy place for him to kind of put his head.
Did he prefer the electric bass?
Well, I think when Joel DeBartolo and Ron Paley came on, and Paul Congella, we went to the electric bass. We had
Yeah.
a lot of problems with bass players. There were times there when I was hiring and firing so many guys, some really good guys, but it's just I couldn't get the right guy. We got Joel DeBartolo. Finally, we got Joel on there for a long length of time. But boy, there were just times when you couldn't get a bass player that Buddy could agree with. I always felt, I felt that Buddy always wanted sometimes a bass player who would kind of go with him if he wanted to move the music up just a little bit in tempo and not hold him back. You know, if you get a bass player that says, no, this is where the time is, and I'm going to
Mhm.
stay. I don't think he always liked that, but sometimes he liked to push the chart just a tiny. I don't know. I really don't know what he
Did you
felt.
did you ever let a guy go that Buddy
Yeah.
disagreed with? Like, why'd you
I
let
let
him go?
I let guys go. I had to fire guys who basically, yeah, he did guys he disagreed with also, but also there were guys who weren't up to the level yet and had to go. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there were guys that
Sure.
had to do that. It was just part of the thing. And once he got somebody that he liked, Joel DeBartolo was really I think one of the ones that stayed for quite a bit, and that's a kind of a story. I don't know how much time you got with that, but Joel had been working with my brother in Rochester with Gap Mangioni's band, and he had worked with Chuck Mangione and with my brother Joe, and so I knew that he could play the gig. I hired him on the gig. He comes, and we were playing in St. Louis, Missouri, and big hotel. And Joel had never seen the book. Now Joel was kind of nervous. He was very nervous, and Joel had a stutter. He really stuttered. He had a problem stuttering. He ended up playing in the Tonight Show band with Johnny Carson for years. He was the bass player. So I got Joel on, and Joel came on the bandstand. And Buddy used to do this bit where he'd come out and Dave Lom was the piano player, and I think that was the time Dave was on. And Buddy would say, "Give me an A," and he'd yell down to the piano player, and the piano player would play an A, and then Buddy would hit the snare drum, and then he'd pretend he was tuning. Buddy comes on that night, and he sees Joel back there, and Joel is just shaking. And Buddy knows it's like a deer in the headlights. So Buddy, and I'm going, oh God, I'm just saying, oh please. And so Buddy turns, instead of going to him, he turns around to Joel and he goes, "Give me an A." And Joel went, "A," like that. Buddy fell on the floor, right off the stool, on the floor, and was rolling around. We couldn't play for 20 minutes. I mean, he just could not stop laughing, Buddy. And Joel was in. Didn't care how he, Buddy just could not. And that was kind of an old bit that they used to do in Rochester, all the Italian.
I
Give
see.
me, and he just kind of just triggered in him, and he just went.
Nice move.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, Joel, that's a classic story.
Oh,
So relieved after that because Buddy loved him after that.
yeah. Well, we've been at this for almost an hour, and I appreciate your stories and your career. I wanted to just go off music for
Sure, yeah.
before we end. I wondering what the feeling in Canada has been about America in the last number of years.
I mean, I'm so disappointed, and I'm kind of hopeful that this new party, Democratic Party, will come in and kind of do something. I'm hoping they're getting blocked. I'm wishing today that both those senators become Democrats because it could be a whole new change for the country. I mean, I've always voted Democratic. There's a couple of times when I maybe thought differently, but most of my leanings have been Democratic. But I mean, what these guys are pulling now, just really upsetting. I just can't understand it. And I mean, I don't understand. First of all, living in Canada, right? I've lived in Canada now since 1974, born in America. So I remember when I was a kid, the word socialism was just like, oh my God, it's like you're going to be like socialism, it's socialism, it's communism. And yet they have, Social Security. And every time a big corporation like the auto industry or anything goes bust, socialism kicks in and they give them, so these guys are all afraid of it. But in Canada, we have basically that kind of a system. Now, when I first moved here, I was really upset about the fact that my taxes all of a sudden, whoa, why am I paying this many amount of taxes? Never had to pay a doctor's bill, 2 kids born. I mean, the medical thing, and you feel so comfortable. There's that pressure of having the fact that when I was traveling with Buddy, every month I had to pay $500 to Blue Cross. If I didn't get that in, my mother would say, make sure your Blue Cross is up because you ever get that fear of you're gonna lose everything if you have to go into the hospital. It's just not here. And so that's a big strain on it. Now, also the other thing is during this period here with COVID, the young musicians who have made $5,000 last year, the government gives you $2,000 a month subsidy to exist. So every young musician gets $2,000, or anybody that's out of work who can prove that they made $5,000 in the previous year, they're giving $2,000 a month to live on. Now it's just gone down to 1,800 because they started taking taxes on it. So young kids who work part-time jobs and all of that, and we're making that kind of money, they get the subsidy basically through the government as a social system. We may end up paying for it, but just having that I guess you can't call it free medical because it's medical that you pay for. Just having that off your back is a big weight off your shoulders, and you have this feeling of comfort that you. I mean, I just dislocated my shoulder 2 weeks ago, so I'm working with this shoulder. I had a slip and fall out on a walk. I went out and it was just so painful. I went down. I went right into the hospital emergency. They put me out. They pulled it back right in.
Oh,
Within 3 hours, I was back home with the shoulder in, and they started me on physio. I have another month of physio to go, but I wish the U.S. could realize that just so what, you pay a little bit more in taxes. People that can't afford it, they'll end up with it. Guys that can afford it, yeah, and so what? And then everybody's covered. I'm telling you, I think that would just make a lot of things better down there.
yeah,
I feel, I don't know, you have a teaching job, you get it. But if you work with certain companies, you'll have a medical plan. But if you get fired or laid off, it's gone, a lot of it.
right.
I don't
Well,
know. I mean, that's
I
my
I
observation.
I appreciate the observation. You have any personal feelings about why this pandemic has occurred, why it occurred in 2019?
I don't. I mean, I just know that this is something that's been coming. My outlook on this right now is I'm trying not to be negative on it. I try to use this time for myself to grow. I'm exercising. I'm doing, I'm practicing every day, exercising, trying to get out and out. Luckily now I have a house with a backyard and different rooms and different levels that I could go to. If I had an apartment, I may be thinking differently, but you can still use it as a period for growth. I've always been, that was my thought all the time. I'm always thinking ahead and planning for the next thing to come and being ready for it. So I think you can use this time to kind of be ready for, for what's to come. I don't know why, I just know that when I was a kid, when I grew up, my mother had to wear masks. My mother would come home at night and she'd have to take her clothes off on the porch and hang them outside and come in and take a shower because she worked with tuberculosis patients.
Oh,
So as from a young kid all the way on, we were dealing with this all the time with this, you don't want to catch this. Then all of a sudden polio kicks in and we had to deal with polio. And, so that was the only, we probably were around at that time with polio. You know,
yes.
so we all know, but I remember my mother, they had to wear the masks all the time on the wards.
All right. Well, Pat, this has really been great, and I'm glad we connected.
Yeah, Monk, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope this helps you. And if you need anything else from me, now I'll try to get these done today. I'll see if I can remember how to fill out a W-2 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Okay. I'm
Yeah,
gonna I'm
W.
gonna I'm gonna pause our recording, and then we can sort of say
Sure.
adios. Okay.